Hey guys, there have been some wonderful episodes and moments in the book so far, but I think in this episode, Scylla and Charybdis, Joyce is really going to start writing over his head. And who would have thought that in an episode that is mainly a lecture about Hamlet, that and Shakespeare, that in a book of fiction it would work so well, and yet it does.
How does he do it?
Going into this episode, I realized that my two favorite episodes in this book, this one and Oxen of the Sun, which is my favorite, they're probably the thickest with annotations. If you look in the annotations for this episode in the book of annotations, they are longer than the episode itself. Is that a coincidence? I think not, because I think that's part of Joyce's method. The thing that people initially find frustrating, all these illusions, are what really make his technique so remarkable, because the first time, yes, they're confusing and frustrating, but the second time, or the more you become acquainted with all these illusions, the more that when you read it, it just sends your mind into all these different directions. It's like a rainbow of thoughts and ideas and images that just come from all different directions. It's wonderful, and this episode is just, it's Shakespeare, a lot of Shakespeare references, tons of paraphrasing of parts of the plays, but more than that, there's tons of other things as well, and that is what that's Joyce's technique, because he realizes you can't just have, you can have a story that's self-contained and all you need is the book itself, but that's not how the world works. Everything is connected to everything else. Everything carries a history. What's that famous line by Faulkner? The past is never dead, it's not even past, because languages, cultures, societies, and individuals all carry their histories with them, and to try and distance that history and ignore it is to, I think, be dishonest, and Joyce never wants to do that. He wants to always show that everything is an assemblage of so many different previous experiences. And all these reflections of history through culture and all the other things I mentioned, they're really reflections of the individual. So the more you become acquainted with all these references and so on, the more you see deeply into yourself. For all these things that seem irrelevant, I think you can tie them to something. This is a very Kabbalistic notion that anything can be connected to anything else. I'm about to read this, the fourth volume in Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill's book, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It's called The Tempest, because I believe the character Prospero is in it. It's a book as thick with annotations as Ulysses, and Alan Moore basically incorporates every fiction or fantastic fiction or any type of fiction really that he wants to into one sort of coherent universe, and it's sometimes pretty amazing. I think I like the first two volumes the best, but I'm looking forward to this one. But that type of book where there's so many references, I know I'm not going to get 90% of the references the first time I read them, but every time I've gone back and read it, I've learned a little more, and I've become a little more familiar with it, and I think it's what allows it to be rereadable. The same with Gravity's Rainbow, which I did a book review on before. You can listen to that if you want, but that I like those kinds of books. They're very different from other types of books. There's nothing quite like them except each other, obviously. I mentioned in that video that introduces Gravity's Rainbow that Pynchon doesn't really distinguish between what he includes in the book. He'll include references to, I think, like Anton Webern and composers at the time of World War II, but then he also includes references to Porky Pig cartoons. So he doesn't distinguish between high and low culture and what is acceptable in fiction. Joyce is the same way. So Joyce grew up reading the Bible extensively as a Catholic, so he includes elements of the Bible. He knows Shakespeare a lot, so he includes all these Shakespeare references. But just like the Irish literary revival, he'll include a splash of it here and there, but he's not going to make that his whole thing. His bigger concept is change, flux, sampling, and showing that underneath all these forms there's something even more impressive than lingering on any one of them. The same is going to be true with his conception, not of just literature, but also spirituality, because even though he was raised Catholic and then he later became exposed to Plato, Aristotle, early Greek philosophers, and so on, he was also aware of things like Madame Blavatsky, who he'll reference in the book. And I think he sees in each of these, even in like Blavatsky, he sees some elements of truth and how they all point to a common truth. I think this is a very Joseph Campbell episode of the book. He's looking for the larger pattern that underlies all these religious systems and spiritual practices. Aldous Huxley had a book called The Perennial Philosophy. I think that's a very similar themed idea. It's just that Joyce expresses it more in literature. And I think Joyce knows, though, that words they're very powerful and amazing, but they have their limitations as well. So he's going to show that Shakespeare, yes, is wonderful, the Bible is wonderful, but even his own writing is something that will one day return to dust, and underneath all that there's something else. The Homeric parallel for this episode is Scylla and Charybdis, who are these two monsters in the ocean who Odysseus is going to have to sail between. Otherwise he's going to have to take a much longer way back home. So he decides to sail between. The goddess Circe, who we haven't even encountered in her Ulysses form in this book, but in the Odyssey, Odysseus had already met her, and she gave Odysseus some advice. She said to him that if he's going to sail between these monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, he needs to sail closer to Scylla. Scylla is a six-headed monster, very fierce and dangerous, but Charybdis is this other monster under the water who belches out and breathes in water and creates this vast whirlpool who, if you get near it, you get sucked in and you're never going to escape. Whereas Scylla, it's a very dangerous monster, but you can kind of escape it. So that's what Odysseus does. He sails closer to Scylla. Scylla has 6 heads, eats 6 of Odysseus' men. Ouch! But then Odysseus, he survives, as he always does, and they just sail on. You can think of Scylla and Charybdis as being between a rock and a hard place, or the devil and the deep blue sea. How will this come into play in Ulysses, in our book? That's a good question. Well, we don't have much of Bloom in this episode, who is our stand-in for Odysseus, but we do have a brief moment where he comes into the library to get this thing for the newspaper, but he's there and then he's gone, and he kind of passes between Stephen and Mulligan. Does that mean that Mulligan and Stephen are Scylla and Charybdis? I don't think that's necessarily the case. These are all very vague. I think more it comes into play in Stephen's lecture, because he's going to be talking about Shakespeare a lot and Shakespeare's ideas and the world of ideas, but also trying to balance these ideas, these really lofty philosophical dreaminess of Shakespeare, with the down-to-earth qualities of Shakespeare, the man who lived a life, was born, died, married, had children, and had this career in London. So Stephen's going to try and balance that, the practical life with the dreamy life, and I think that's closer to the Scylla and Charybdis that Stephen's going to be navigating between, as he is. We've talked about this before. This is something that Stephen himself is trying to resolve in his mind and his life. You also may want to think of Scylla and Charybdis as, remember Stephen Daedalus's name. Daedalus made these wings. His son was Icarus. He made these wings for them to fly up near the sun, but then that's the lofty artist who's sailing up in the dreamy world, but then they also have to come back down to the earth and land safely. Icarus, I think he flew too high to the sun and he crashed and burned. So Stephen doesn't want to do that. He needs to walk that fine line between Scylla and Charybdis.